There are many kinds of tragedy in the world. Some are loud. Some are violent. Some leave behind headlines and crowds of grieving people. But the quietest tragedies are often the most painful. The ones nobody sees. The ones that happen behind the tall gates of enormous houses. The ones that happen to people everyone assumes are happy. Because they are rich. Because they are powerful. Because they seem to have everything. But sometimes the truth is very different. Sometimes the loneliest person in the entire city is the one living inside the biggest mansion. And that was exactly the case for a woman named Margaret Whitmore. Margaret Whitmore was a billionaire. Her name appeared in magazines. Her companies stretched across continents. Her homes were scattered around the world. New York, London, Paris, Dubai. Everywhere she went, people treated her like royalty. But when the cameras disappeared and the doors closed behind her, Margaret Whitmore was completely alone. Her mansion was enormous. 32 rooms. Marble floors that echoed with every step. Crystal chandeliers that sparkled above empty hallways. A dining table large enough to seat 20 guests. But most nights, there was only one chair occupied. Margaret would sit at the far end of the table, with a single plate in front of her, and silence filling the rest of the room. Not because she had no family. She did. A son, a daughter, 2 nephews, a sister. But somehow, despite all the wealth, despite all the success, despite all the years she had spent building an empire, Margaret Whitmore had become a stranger to the people who shared her blood. Phone calls grew shorter. Visits became rarer. Excuses became easier. Eventually, they stopped coming at all. And so the billionaire, who once commanded boardrooms full of executives, began spending most of her days walking alone through rooms that were far too large for one person. The staff noticed it first. The quiet. The way she would sometimes pause in the middle of a hallway, as if listening for something or someone. But the mansion stayed silent, day after day, year after year, until the morning everything changed. It happened on Margaret Whitmore's 60th birthday. The staff had prepared the house like they did every year. Flowers in the entrance hall, a cake in the dining room, candles waiting to be lit. But something felt different that morning, because Margaret had already made a decision she had been thinking about for months. A decision that would eventually shock everyone who believed they knew her, even her own family. But at that moment, nobody knew what she was planning. Not the lawyers, not the servants, not the relatives who only called when they needed something, and definitely not the boy who was sitting outside the iron gates of her mansion. A boy nobody in that neighborhood had ever noticed before. A boy with worn clothes, tired eyes, and no place to call home. A homeless boy. On the morning of Margaret Whitmore's 60th birthday, that boy was simply trying to survive another day. He had no idea that within a few hours, he would walk into the life of one of the richest women in the country. He had no idea that one simple act of kindness would change both of their lives forever. And he certainly had no idea that months later, inside a silent funeral hall, he would be asked to read something that would leave an entire room speechless. Because when the words inside Margaret Whitmore's were finally revealed, nothing, absolutely nothing, would go the way her family expected. And the truth behind her final decision would begin with the moment she first noticed the boy sitting outside her gate. Sympathy set up and the first contrast. Morning arrived slowly over the Whitmore estate. Sunlight crept across the tall iron gates. It moved along the long driveway, and eventually it reached the enormous mansion sitting quietly at the top of the hill. From the outside, the house looked perfect. Flawless white stone, tall glass windows reflecting the sky, gardens trimmed with a kind of precision only wealth could maintain. Everything about the property spoke the same message: success, power, prestige. But inside the mansion, the atmosphere felt very different. The halls were silent. The rooms were still. And somewhere on the second floor, Margaret Whitmore stood alone beside a wide bedroom window. She was dressed elegantly as always. Her posture was straight, her appearance controlled. To the outside world, she still looked like the powerful billionaire everyone admired. But when she looked down toward the gates of her property, her expression softened. There was a quiet sadness behind her eyes. Because Margaret Whitmore knew something most people never understood. Money could buy comfort. Money could buy security. Money could buy power. But there were two things it could never buy: time and genuine love. For years, Margaret had tried to ignore that truth. She built companies. She traveled the world. She appeared in interviews. She shook hands with presidents and investors. But none of those things followed her home at night. When the meetings ended and the cameras turned off, the silence always returned. And over time, that silence became impossible to ignore. Downstairs, the household staff began their normal routine. Footsteps echoed lightly through the marble hallways. Breakfast trays were prepared. Curtains were opened. But everyone working in that house understood something without ever saying it out loud. This mansion was far too large for one person. Margaret Whitmore had built an empire. But somewhere along the way, she had lost the people who were supposed to share it. Her children rarely visited. Her relatives called only when they needed something. And the house that once hosted grand celebrations had slowly become a monument to absence. Yet on this particular morning, something unusual caught Margaret's attention. At first it was just a small movement near the front gates. A shape sitting on the sidewalk beyond the property line. Margaret narrowed her eyes slightly. From the distance, it was difficult to see clearly. But as the morning light grew stronger, the figure became more visible. It was a boy, young, thin. His clothes were worn and dusty. A small backpack rested beside him. And for a moment, he simply sat there quietly, watching the world pass by. Margaret studied him with curiosity. Children did not usually appear outside her gates, especially not children who looked like that. The neighborhood surrounding the Whitmore estate was known for its luxury, expensive homes, private security, clean streets. But the boy sitting outside the gate clearly did not belong to that world. He looked like someone the city had forgotten. A homeless boy. Margaret continued watching. At first she assumed he would eventually move along. Maybe he was resting. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But minutes passed. Then more minutes. And the boy remained there, completely still, as if the sidewalk itself had become his home. Margaret felt something stir inside her. Not pity. Not exactly. It was something deeper. Something familiar. Loneliness recognized loneliness. Meanwhile, outside the gates, the boy shifted slightly. His name was Daniel. And Daniel had already been awake for hours. The cold morning air had forced him to leave the small corner behind a grocery store where he sometimes slept. He had wandered through several streets, looking for a quiet place to sit. Somewhere safe. Somewhere people would ignore him. The sidewalk outside the Whitmore estate had seemed perfect. Nobody bothered him there. Most of the passing cars never slowed down. And the enormous gates created a small patch of shade where he could rest. Daniel pulled his backpack closer. Inside it were the only things he owned. A thin blanket, a water bottle, and a worn paperback book with half the pages missing. He opened the book and began reading silently. The world around him faded. Cars passed. Wind moved gently through the trees. And inside the mansion, beyond the gates, Margaret Whitmore continued watching. She noticed the book first. A homeless boy reading. That detail surprised her. Then she noticed something else. The way he held the book carefully. The way he turned each page slowly, as if every word mattered. Margaret leaned slightly closer to the glass. Something about the scene felt strangely important, as if this quiet moment was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. And, in a way, it was, because this small, ordinary morning would eventually lead to a decision that shocked an entire family. A decision that would be written into a legal document. A document that would remain sealed for months. until the day it was finally opened in a silent funeral hall. But that moment was still far in the future. Right now, there was only a lonely billionaire inside a mansion, and a homeless boy sitting outside her gate. Two lives separated by wealth, separated by opportunity, separated by circumstances neither of them had chosen, yet somehow connected by something invisible. Margaret continued watching the boy. Daniel continued reading his book. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them knew the other was observing. But sometimes the most important relationships begin with a moment exactly like this. Quiet, unexpected, almost invisible. And within the next hour, something would happen that would bring those two worlds together for the first time. A small event, a simple gesture, but the kind of moment that changes everything. Because sometimes the person who changes your life forever is someone the rest of the world never even notices. And when Margaret Whitmore finally walked toward the front gate that morning, neither she nor the boy waiting outside had any idea that their meeting would eventually rewrite the future of an entire fortune. But that story was only just beginning. The moment that changes everything. Margaret Whitmore continued watching the boy outside her gate. From the second-floor window, she could see him clearly now. He was sitting on the pavement with his back against the tall iron bars. A book rested in his hands. The pages were worn. The cover looked faded. But the boy read it with careful attention, as if the story inside mattered more than the world around him. Margaret watched quietly. Something about the scene felt unusual. Most people walking past her property never stopped. Most people barely looked at the gates. But this boy had chosen that exact spot to sit, and he had not moved for nearly an hour. Inside the mansion, the housekeeper knocked softly on the bedroom door. "Breakfast is ready, Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret did not immediately respond. Her attention was still fixed on the boy outside. Finally she spoke. "Leave it in the dining room." Her voice was calm, controlled, but her eyes remained on the gate. Because something about that boy stirred a question she could not ignore. Why here? Why today? And more importantly, why did he look so familiar? Not his face, not his clothes, but the feeling he carried with him. Loneliness. Margaret knew that feeling well. Outside the gate, Daniel closed the book for a moment. He stretched his arms slowly. Then he looked around the quiet street. Most of the houses in the neighborhood were enormous. Tall fences, private cameras, security guards, places where someone like him did not belong. Yet no one had told him to leave. Not yet. So he stayed. For Daniel, the sidewalk outside the Whitmore estate had one important advantage. It was quiet. People ignored him. And when you lived on the street, being ignored could sometimes feel like safety. But Daniel did not know something important. High above him, behind the tall windows of the mansion, someone was watching. Someone powerful. Someone who had already begun asking questions about him. And that person was Margaret Whitmore. Back inside the mansion, Margaret finally stepped away from the window. She walked slowly through the hallway. Her footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. For a moment she paused, thinking. Then she turned toward the staircase leading downstairs. The decision forming in her mind was small, simple, almost insignificant. But it would become the first step in a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Because sometimes the smallest decisions create the biggest consequences. Meanwhile, outside the gate, Daniel reopened his book. The morning sun had grown warmer. Traffic moved slowly in the distance. Everything felt ordinary, normal. But that calm moment was about to change. Inside the mansion, Margaret reached the front entrance. The butler looked surprised when he saw her approaching the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore." "Good morning, Thomas." She stopped in front of the large wooden doors. Then she asked a question. "Is there a boy sitting outside the gate?" Thomas hesitated. "Yes. I noticed him earlier. Should I ask security to move him along?" Margaret paused for a moment. Her expression remained thoughtful. "No," she said quietly. "Open the gate." Thomas blinked. Just for a second. But he quickly nodded. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. Moments later, the heavy iron gate began to move. The metal bars slid slowly apart with a low mechanical sound. Outside on the sidewalk, Daniel looked up. His eyes narrowed slightly. Gates like this rarely opened for people like him. In fact, they usually opened to keep people like him out. So when the gate moved aside, Daniel felt a sudden wave of uncertainty. He stood slowly, not sure what to expect. From the long driveway, a figure began walking toward him. Elegant, composed, confident. Even from a distance, it was obvious this was someone important, someone powerful. Daniel felt a quiet tension in his chest, because he had seen people like this before, and those encounters rarely ended well. As the woman approached the gate, Daniel lowered his eyes, preparing himself for the usual words. "You cannot stay here. Move along. Leave before security calls the police." But those words never came. Instead, the woman stopped a few feet away and spoke calmly. "What are you reading?" Daniel looked up, surprised. He held the book slightly tighter. "It is just a story," he answered quietly. Margaret glanced at the worn pages, and for a moment something unexpected happened. She smiled. Not the polite smile she used in business meetings. A genuine smile. One she had not shown in a very long time. "A boy who reads," she said softly. "That is something I have not seen in a while." Daniel did not respond. He simply stood there, uncertain, because he still did not understand why this woman was speaking to him. And neither did the staff watching quietly from inside the mansion, from the windows above, from the security cameras near the driveway. Everyone saw the same thing. One of the richest women in the country, standing face to face with a homeless boy. But nobody knew something important. Not yet. Margaret Whitmore had already begun thinking about a decision that would eventually be written into her final will. A decision that would shock every member of her family. But that truth remained hidden. For now. Because the most powerful secrets are never revealed at the beginning of the story. They wait, patiently, until the exact moment when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And when that moment finally arrived, inside a silent funeral hall months later, the words read aloud would leave everyone frozen in their seats. Because the boy standing beside Margaret Whitmore's grave was not supposed to be there. At least that is what her family believed. But they were about to learn something important. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who changes everything. And Margaret Whitmore had just taken the first step toward proving it. From loneliness to something unexpected, Margaret Whitmore stood quietly beside the open gate. The morning breeze moved gently through the trees. Cars passed slowly on the distant road. For a moment, the world felt strangely still. In front of her stood the boy, Daniel, thin shoulders, worn shoes, a small backpack resting against the fence. The kind of boy most people would walk past without even noticing. But Margaret noticed him. And more importantly, she noticed something else. The way he held that book. Carefully, respectfully, as if the words inside were valuable. That detail stayed in her mind. Because in a world where people chased money and power, very few still treated knowledge with that kind of care. Margaret studied him quietly. "You enjoy reading," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. His voice was soft, almost cautious. "Books help pass the time." Margaret tilted her head slightly. Pass the time. Those words carried a quiet weight. Because Margaret Whitmore understood something about time. For most of her life, she had been chasing it. Building businesses. Signing contracts. Expanding companies. Every hour had once been scheduled. Every minute had once been valuable. But recently something had changed. The days had started feeling longer. The nights had started feeling quieter. And the mansion had started feeling larger than ever before. Because when a house is filled with people, its size feels impressive. But when a house is empty, its size feels like silence. Margaret turned slightly and looked back toward the mansion behind her. 32 rooms. Endless hallways. Beautiful furniture. But almost no voices. Almost no laughter. Almost no life. Then she looked back at the boy, and something unexpected happened inside her chest. A small spark of warmth. The kind of feeling she had not experienced in a long time. "What kind of book is it?" she asked. Daniel lifted the worn pages slightly. "It is a story about a boy who travels to different cities," he said. Margaret smiled faintly. "And does he find what he is looking for?" Daniel hesitated. Then he answered honestly, "Not yet." That answer lingered in the air between them. Not yet. It was a simple phrase, but it carried hope. And hope was something Margaret Whitmore had almost forgotten. Inside the mansion, the house staff watched the conversation through the tall windows. They whispered quietly among themselves. Because this was unusual. Very unusual. Margaret Whitmore rarely spoke to strangers. And she almost never stopped to talk to someone standing outside her gate. But this morning felt different. Outside the gate, Daniel shifted slightly. He was not used to conversations like this, especially not with someone who clearly belonged to a completely different world. But Margaret continued asking gentle questions. "Do you live nearby?" Daniel looked down at the pavement. "Not exactly," he answered. Margaret understood immediately. She did not ask anything else about it. Sometimes silence can show more respect than curiosity. Instead, she asked another question. "Do you go to school?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "Not anymore." The answer was simple, but the meaning behind it was heavy. Margaret felt that familiar sadness return, because she knew what opportunity looked like. She had built an empire from it. And yet here was a boy sitting outside her gate without even a chance to attend school. For a moment, Margaret said nothing. The silence stretched between them. Then Daniel did something unexpected. He opened the book again, and he continued reading. Right there, standing beside the gate, Margaret watched him, confused at first. Then she realized something important. The boy was comfortable with silence. He was not trying to impress her. He was not asking for money. He was simply returning to the story he had been reading before she arrived. And that small act revealed something powerful about his character. Kindness without expectation. Focus without distraction. Quiet dignity. Margaret felt that warmth in her chest grow slightly stronger. But while this quiet moment was unfolding outside the gate, something very different was happening somewhere else. Across the city, inside a luxury apartment, Margaret Whitmore's son was speaking with a lawyer. His voice was impatient. "You said she is getting older?" he asked. The lawyer nodded carefully. "Yes, but she is still very capable." Margaret Whitmore was known for making decisions quickly, and her family knew that one day her fortune would be divided. Properties, companies, investments, millions, possibly billions. The conversation in that apartment was not about love. It was not about concern. It was about inheritance. And that quiet truth would soon grow into something much darker. Because when money becomes the center of family relationships, trust begins to disappear, and greed begins to grow. Back outside the Whitmore estate, Margaret turned to Daniel once again. "You must be hungry," she said. Daniel looked up quickly. He had not expected that question. "A little," he admitted. Margaret nodded toward the open gate. "Come inside." Daniel froze. Just for a moment. Because invitations like that never happened in his world. And part of him wondered if this was a mistake. But Margaret waited patiently, her expression calm, her voice steady. Inside the mansion, the staff watched with wide eyes. Because the next few seconds would change everything. Daniel slowly stepped forward. One step, then another. And then he crossed the gate. For the first time, the boy the city had forgotten had just entered one of the largest homes in the neighborhood. But nobody watching that moment understood what it truly meant. Not the staff. Not Margaret's family. Not even Daniel himself. Because the story unfolding here was not just about kindness. It was about something much bigger. A decision that had already begun forming quietly in Margaret Whitmore's mind. A decision that would one day be written into a sealed envelope. An envelope that would remain hidden until the day it was finally opened in front of her entire family. And when those words were finally read aloud, the room would fall completely silent, because the future Margaret Whitmore had chosen was not the future her family expected, not even close. The large doors of the Whitmore mansion opened slowly. Daniel stepped inside. For a moment, he stopped moving, because the world inside the house looked completely different from the world he knew. The floors were polished marble. The ceilings stretched high above his head. Light poured in through tall windows. Everything looked clean, perfect, untouched. Daniel stood near the entrance, his small backpack resting against his shoulder. He did not know where to look first. Margaret Whitmore watched his reaction carefully. She had seen this expression before, years ago, back when she first walked into the headquarters of her own company, back when she was younger, back when everything felt new. But this time the moment felt different, because the boy standing in her hallway was not thinking about business. He was simply overwhelmed by space, by silence, by a world he had never entered before. Margaret spoke gently. "You can come in." Daniel nodded slowly. He stepped forward. His shoes made a soft sound against the marble floor. Inside the mansion, several members of the staff paused their work. They watched quietly, because this scene felt unusual. A homeless boy walking through the halls of the Whitmore estate. It was something none of them had ever seen before. Margaret noticed their reactions, but she said nothing. Instead, she walked toward the dining room. Daniel followed carefully behind her. Every few steps he glanced around. Paintings hung on the walls. Large windows overlooked the gardens. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling. Everything looked expensive. But something else stood out. Something that surprised him. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret stopped beside the long dining table. She pulled out a chair. "Sit," she said. Daniel hesitated for a second. Then he slowly sat down. A housekeeper placed a plate in front of him. Fresh bread, warm soup, fruit. Daniel stared at the food. His hands remained still. Margaret noticed. "You should eat," she said. Daniel looked up. "Are you sure?" Margaret nodded. "Of course." Daniel picked up the spoon. Slowly, carefully. The first bite was small, but then something changed. Hunger took over. Within minutes the plate was nearly empty. Margaret watched quietly from across the table. There was no judgment in her expression, only observation, only thought, because she was noticing things that most people would ignore. The way Daniel said thank you after each plate. The way he folded the napkin neatly. The way he looked around the room with curiosity rather than greed. Small details, but important ones. Very important. After the meal ended, Daniel placed the spoon down gently. "Thank you," he said. His voice carried real gratitude. Margaret nodded slowly. "You are welcome." The room became quiet again. For a moment neither of them spoke. But the silence felt different now. Less distant. Less cold. More human. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. She studied the boy across from her. "Tell me something," she said. Daniel looked up. "Why do you read so much?" Daniel glanced toward the book resting beside his backpack. Then he answered honestly. "Because stories make the world feel bigger." Margaret felt a small reaction inside her chest. Stories make the world feel bigger. It was a simple sentence, but it carried truth. Because Margaret Whitmore had spent most of her life trying to make the world bigger through business, through companies, through investments. But maybe there were other ways to expand life. Quieter ways. More meaningful ways. Margaret asked another question. "Do you have family?" Daniel's expression changed slightly. His eyes lowered. "Not really," he answered. Margaret did not press further. Sometimes the past does not need to be explained. Sometimes it is already written in a person's silence. The conversation paused again. But something important had already begun forming between them. Understanding. Not through long speeches. Not through dramatic moments. But through small details. Small kindness. Small honesty. Meanwhile, far away from the quiet dining room of the Whitmore mansion, another conversation was taking place. A very different one. Inside a sleek office building downtown, Margaret Whitmore's daughter sat across from a financial advisor. Her tone was sharp, confident, almost impatient. "My mother has several properties listed under her name," she said. The advisor nodded carefully. "Yes, her portfolio is quite extensive." Margaret's daughter leaned forward slightly. "And what happens to those assets eventually?" The advisor paused. "That depends on her will." The daughter leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. But behind that calm expression was something else. Expectation. Because she believed the future of that fortune was already decided. After all, she was family. She had always assumed the wealth would pass down to them. But what she did not know was that her mother's thinking had already begun to change. And that change had started with a simple moment outside a gate. A boy, a book, and a conversation nobody expected. Back inside the mansion, Margaret stood from the dining table. She walked toward the large windows overlooking the garden. Daniel remained seated. He watched her quietly. Margaret spoke without turning around. "Do you know something about large houses?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Margaret looked out across the empty lawn. "They can feel very lonely," she said softly. Daniel looked around the room again. At the long table, the empty chairs, the silent walls. And suddenly he understood something. This house, for all its beauty, for all its size, was missing something important. People. Margaret turned back toward him, her voice calm, her expression thoughtful. That was the moment something began changing in her mind. A thought, a possibility, a question about the future, a question about what really mattered. And although nobody in that room realized it yet, that quiet moment would eventually shape a decision written into Margaret Whitmore's final will. A decision that would leave her entire family stunned. Because the future she was beginning to imagine did not look anything like the one they were expecting. Every powerful story is built around people, not just events, not just moments, people. Because it is the choices people make that shape everything that follows. And in this story, for very different kinds of people would eventually collide. Each one carrying a different truth. Each one believing a different future was waiting for them. The first was Margaret Whitmore. To the world, she was a billionaire, a business icon, a woman whose name appeared in financial magazines and corporate reports. But those titles only described her public life. They did not describe the woman who stood quietly in the dining room of her silent mansion, looking out at the empty gardens. Margaret Whitmore had spent decades building an empire. She started with almost nothing, a small office, a few determined ideas, and a willingness to work harder than anyone around her. Year after year, she expanded. Companies grew. Investments multiplied. Her name slowly became powerful. But success has a strange way of changing relationships. The higher Margaret climbed, the further some people drifted away. At first the distance was small. A missed dinner, a delayed visit, a phone call that never happened. But slowly those small distances became large spaces. And eventually the people who once filled Margaret's life were no longer there. Her children grew busy with their own ambitions. Her relatives discovered new priorities. And somewhere along the way, Margaret Whitmore became something unexpected. A powerful woman surrounded by silence. Lonely, misunderstood, emotionally wounded in ways nobody talked about. The world admired her strength, but very few people noticed her sadness. Inside the mansion, the quiet rooms carried memories. Birthdays, family dinners, holiday celebrations, moments that once filled the halls with laughter. Now those memories lived only in Margaret's mind. Sometimes she walked through the house, remembering where everyone used to sit, where her son once laughed, where her daughter once opened gifts. But those voices were gone now, replaced by stillness. And over time, that stillness left scars. Not visible scars, but emotional ones. The kind that grow slowly. The kind that change how a person sees the world. Yet despite that pain, Margaret Whitmore still carried something rare. Generosity. Because people who understand loneliness often recognize it in others. And that recognition was exactly what happened the moment she saw Daniel sitting outside her gate. Daniel was the second person in this story. The boy most people would overlook. The boy the city had quietly forgotten. But Daniel was not defined by his situation. He was defined by his character. Kindness lived naturally in him. Humility shaped his actions. Honesty guided his words. Even after years of struggle, something inside Daniel remained untouched. Innocence. The kind of innocence that does not disappear even when life becomes difficult. When Margaret first noticed him reading outside the gate, she did not see a homeless boy. She saw something deeper. A quiet dignity. A young mind still searching for knowledge. A boy who treated stories with respect. And those small details mattered. Because character often reveals itself in the smallest moments. The way someone speaks. The way someone listens. The way someone treats kindness when it is offered. Daniel never asked for anything. Not money. Not favors. Not sympathy. He simply existed with patience. And that quiet honesty would eventually become the most powerful truth in the entire story. But while Margaret and Daniel were forming a quiet understanding inside the mansion, another group of people were thinking about something very different. Margaret's family. From the outside, they looked respectable, successful, well-dressed, confident. But behind closed doors, their conversations often revolved around one subject. Inheritance. Margaret Whitmore's fortune was enormous. Properties across several cities. Corporate shares. Private investments. Assets worth millions. Possibly more. And over the years her family had quietly begun imagining how that fortune would eventually be divided. They believed they were entitled to it. After all, they were blood. Her son believed the companies would become his. Her daughter believed the properties would pass to her. Her nephews assumed the rest would naturally fall into place. None of them questioned that future. None of them imagined anything different. But greed has a way of blinding people. Because when someone focuses only on what they expect to receive, they stop paying attention to what they might lose. And Margaret Whitmore had been paying attention for a long time. She noticed the phone calls that only came when money was involved. She noticed the polite smiles that disappeared when she refused a request. She noticed the way conversations about family slowly turned into conversations about assets. And those small observations began forming a quiet disappointment inside her heart. Not anger. Something deeper. Betrayal. Meanwhile, far from those private family discussions, another person was unknowingly preparing to play an important role in the future. A lawyer named Edward Collins. Edward Collins had worked with Margaret Whitmore for many years. He was careful, professional, always calm, the kind of man who spoke only when necessary. Most people saw him as neutral, just a legal advisor. But lawyers often become witnesses to decisions that change lives. And one day soon, Margaret Whitmore would sit across from Edward Collins with a request that would surprise even him. A request involving a document that would remain sealed for months, hidden inside a legal envelope, waiting for the moment it would finally be opened. And when that moment arrived, another group of people would become part of the story. The audience at Margaret Whitmore's funeral, relatives, business partners, old acquaintances, all gathered in quiet expectation. They would sit in long rows of chairs inside a silent hall, listening carefully as the lawyer read the final words Margaret Whitmore left behind. Some faces would show sadness. Some would show curiosity. But many would show something else. Anticipation. Because they believed they already knew what the will would say. They believed the fortune would follow the predictable path. Family. Blood. Inheritance. But when Edward Collins finally reached the most important paragraph in that document, the reaction inside that room would change instantly. Heads would turn. Voices would fall silent. And every person in that funeral hall would look toward someone standing quietly in the corner. The boy nobody expected to see there. Daniel. Because the future Margaret Whitmore had chosen was very different from the future her family imagined. And the moment that truth was revealed, nothing inside that room would ever feel the same again. Stories that stay in people's minds do something very specific. They do not simply move forward. They tighten. Every moment adds pressure. Every scene reveals something new. Every conversation changes the emotional balance of the story. And slowly, almost quietly, the stakes begin to rise. That is exactly what was happening inside the Whitmore mansion. The first shift had already happened. Loneliness had opened the door. Daniel had walked through it. But that was only the beginning. Because every meaningful story grows through contrast. And the contrast between Margaret Whitmore and Daniel could not have been greater. One lived inside a mansion filled with priceless art and polished marble floors. The other had spent nights sleeping behind grocery stores and bus stations. One controlled companies worth millions. The other owned a backpack and a worn book. But something strange was happening. Inside that enormous house, those differences were beginning to feel smaller, not larger. Because kindness does not measure wealth. Kindness measures character. And Daniel's character was revealing itself slowly. Over small moments. Over quiet conversations. Over simple actions that carried real sincerity. After finishing his meal that morning, Daniel stood from the table. He carefully carried his empty bowl toward the kitchen. One of the housekeepers looked surprised. "You can leave it there," she said gently. Daniel shook his head. "It is okay," he replied. He placed the bowl carefully in the sink. Then he thanked her. Small actions. But Margaret Whitmore noticed every one of them. From across the room, she watched quietly. Because people reveal who they are when they believe nobody important is watching. And Daniel believed exactly that. He did not know Margaret was studying his behavior. He did not know she was comparing it with something else. With someone else. Because far away from the mansion, Margaret's children were still discussing her future. And their conversations sounded very different. In a quiet restaurant downtown, Margaret's son leaned across the table toward his sister. "She has to make a decision eventually," he said. His voice was calm. But underneath that calm was expectation. Their sister nodded slowly. "Of course she will. Everything eventually comes to family." They spoke about the future as if it was already guaranteed. As if Margaret Whitmore's fortune had already been divided in their minds. But that confidence came from a dangerous assumption. They believed blood guaranteed loyalty. They believed family guaranteed inheritance. They believed Margaret would never choose anything else. But they were wrong. And Margaret Whitmore had already begun realizing something important. Blood does not always create loyalty. Sometimes loyalty comes from somewhere else entirely. Back inside the mansion, the emotional atmosphere was slowly changing. At first Daniel felt like a visitor, someone passing through. But as the morning continued, the conversations between him and Margaret became easier, more natural. She asked about the books he liked. He told her about the stories he remembered. He spoke about places he dreamed of visiting, cities he had only read about. Margaret listened carefully, because something about Daniel's perspective fascinated her. He looked at the world with curiosity, not entitlement. He saw possibilities, not possessions. And Margaret found herself remembering something she had almost forgotten. What it felt like to believe the future could still surprise you. At one point Daniel walked toward the large windows facing the garden. He looked outside with quiet wonder. "You must really like this house," he said. Margaret walked beside him. For a moment she said nothing. Then she answered honestly, "Sometimes." Daniel looked confused. "Only sometimes." Margaret nodded. "A house this big can feel empty," she said softly. Daniel looked across the wide lawn. Then he looked back toward the long, silent hallway behind them. Suddenly he understood something most visitors would never notice. This mansion was beautiful, but it was also lonely, very lonely. Margaret noticed the realization in his eyes. And that moment created another small shift between them. Understanding, not through explanation, through observation. But while these quiet connections were forming inside the Whitmore estate, something darker was beginning to grow somewhere else. Margaret's family had started paying closer attention. Her son made another phone call to the lawyer. "Just checking," he said casually. "Has my mother mentioned updating her will recently?" The lawyer paused. That kind of question always carried weight. "Not recently," he answered carefully. Margaret's son relaxed slightly. "Good," he said, "because everything is already set up the way it should be." But he was wrong. Very wrong. Because Margaret Whitmore had already begun thinking about change. Not immediately, not impulsively, but slowly, quietly, over conversations that nobody else witnessed. And every day Daniel returned to the mansion, that thought grew stronger. They talked in the garden. They talked in the library. Sometimes they simply sat in silence while Daniel read. And Margaret began noticing something extraordinary. The mansion did not feel as empty when Daniel was there. The rooms felt warmer. The silence felt lighter. But that was not the biggest change. The biggest change was happening inside Margaret's mind. Because she had already started asking herself a difficult question. A question about fairness. A question about loyalty. A question about who truly deserved the future she would leave behind. And although she had not spoken those thoughts out loud yet, the decision had already begun forming. A decision no one in her family would ever expect. A decision that would eventually be written into a sealed legal document. But that moment was still ahead. Because before the truth could be revealed, the story needed one final turning point. One event that would change everything. And when that moment finally arrived, the mansion would fall silent once again. Only this time the silence would carry something much heavier. Loss. Because Margaret Whitmore's story was moving toward its final chapter. And when the lawyer eventually opened the envelope containing her last decision, the room would fall completely still. Because the name written inside that will was not the name anyone in her family expected to hear. Stories like this often begin quietly. A lonely house, a forgotten boy, a meeting that seems ordinary at first. But before we continue with what happened inside the Whitmore mansion, there is something important to say. Because the story you are hearing right now has reached people in many different places around the world. Different cities. Different countries, different lives. Yet stories about kindness and unexpected choices connect us all. So if you enjoy stories that reveal the hidden side of human decisions, take a moment right now to support the channel. Simply like this video and subscribe for more stories like this one. Your support helps these stories reach more people. And it allows us to continue sharing moments that remind us something important. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes. And while you are here, tell us something in the comments. Where are you watching from today? What city? What country? It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, let us return to the Whitmore mansion. Because while the outside world continues moving forward, something much more personal is unfolding inside that quiet estate. Margaret Whitmore stands near the window of her enormous home. The garden stretches wide and empty before her. The same view she has seen thousands of times. The same view that once felt like a symbol of success. But lately it feels different, quieter, heavier. Because Margaret Whitmore has begun thinking about something that will soon affect everyone connected to her life. A decision. A private decision. One she has not shared with her family. One she has not spoken about publicly. Yet. But that decision did not begin with lawyers. It did not begin with documents. It began with something much simpler. A conversation. A book. A quiet moment at the front gate of her mansion. And the boy who stepped through that gate without realizing how important his presence would become. Daniel continues sitting at the long dining table. The sunlight from the tall windows reflects softly across the polished floor. For the first time in a long while, the house feels less silent. less empty. Because sometimes the presence of a single person can change the emotional atmosphere of an entire place. Margaret notices it. Even the staff notice it. The rooms feel different. Not louder, just warmer. But this quiet change is only the beginning of something much larger. Because outside the walls of the Whitmore estate, other people are beginning to watch more carefully. Margaret's family. The people who believe they already understand how the future will unfold. The people who believe they already know who will inherit everything she built. But they are about to learn something surprising. Because Margaret Whitmore is not the kind of woman who allows others to decide her legacy. She built her empire by making unexpected decisions. And the final decision she is preparing to make will surprise everyone, especially the people who believe they deserve it the most. But that moment is still ahead. For now, the mansion remains quiet. Margaret Whitmore walks slowly through the hallway. Daniel sits beside the window with his worn book open again. Neither of them fully understands where this story is going. Not yet. But somewhere in Margaret's mind, a thought continues growing stronger. A question about loyalty. A question about fairness. A question about what truly matters when a lifetime of success finally reaches its final chapter. And the answer to that question will eventually be written inside a sealed envelope. An envelope that will remain hidden until the day a lawyer opens it in front of a silent room. And when that moment finally arrives, the truth inside Margaret Whitmore's final words will leave everyone frozen in their seats. Because the person she chose to trust with her future is the last person anyone expected